Okay, so today we're going to answer the question that a lot of folks always ask, and there doesn't really seem to be a clear answer. And the question very simply is, do I really need analog gear in my studio? Okay, so welcome back again to another edition of FX Studio 2. I am your host, G Sharp Jams. And today, as I said, we're going to take a look at the question that's asked a lot, especially by beginners just getting into home studios and things of that nature. And we know that we have plugins and we have analog gear, and the choice is clearly up to the individual which way they want to go. And some folks go hybrid, they'll get both analog gear and plugin modules as well. Now, question is, let's take a look at this to begin. This is the Rupert Neve 535 diode bridge compressor. Goes for about $1,000, somewhere in that neighborhood. And this is the Arturia Comp 609, which goes for about $100. They both work great. They both get the job done. So the question becomes, why in the world would anyone in their sane mind spend $1,000 on this when they could spend $100 on this? And the answer is very simple, actually. It just comes down to personal preference. Now, I know before you start putting comments in the comments box below and saying, oh, it's a lot more than that, there's more to it than that. Believe me, I get that. I get that. There is a lot more to it than that. But keep this in mind. People try to compare analog gear, and you've seen the videos here on YouTube. They have what they call the shootouts between this piece of analog gear and then the plug-in version of the same thing. And they say, well, which one sounds better? Which one works better? Which one should I be buying? And, that's fine, but keep something in mind. And I'm just going to address the elephant in the room, and I'm going to go ahead and say this right off the bat. Is analog gear better than a plugin? And the answer to that is a very simple no. Analog gear is not better than plugin modules. And here's why I say that. Analog is analog. Digital is digital. To say that one is better than the other is like trying to compare apples to oranges. You just can't do it. They are programmed differently. The algorithms used to create these plugins are different from the hard wiring that's inside the analog gear. And there's a lot of wiring and a lot of different things going on in this piece of gear here, as opposed to software, which is coded with algorithms and all that other fun stuff that I know nothing or very little about, so I'm not going to try to explain all that. But they're completely different. Analog gear is going to give you that thick, warm sound, real nice chunky on the bottom and nicely rounded out on the top, the high frequencies, whereas digital plugins are going to give you very tinny sound. The high ends may come across a little bit sharp. They're peaked, they're not really rounded off, and the bottom is not there as much as the bottom is there when you're using analog gear. So there's a difference. That's the key word, the difference between the two. How are the two different from each other? Not is one better than the other one. It's only better if it's something that you've chosen to use because it's the way that you like to work. That's what makes it better. If you prefer using plugins, go ahead and use a plugin. If you prefer to use analog gear and you like physically touching buttons and spinning knobs and things of that nature, then go ahead and use analog gear. But understand that there is a difference between the two. Do they sound different? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I will go as far as saying this. And I know there's a lot of debate out there about this topic. However, Analog gear compared to a plug-in piece of software is not going to sound the same. And I know that there are a lot of plugins that claim that this thing sounds just like the original that we've modeled it after, and yes, it sounds really great. You can barely hear the difference between the two. And yes, that is true. That is very true. But the key is they will say it sounds very close to the original that it's been modeled after. They're never going to say, I don't think I've ever seen one where the producer of the product says it sounds exactly the same. It is an exact replication, because it can't possibly be. At least not today in 2023. Now, 20 years from now, with technology going at the rate that it is and things just getting a lot more sophisticated, maybe 10, 20 years from now, that might be a different story. And they will sound exactly the same. But right now, here in 2023, they do not sound exactly the same. There is a difference. And the biggest difference between the two is the analog gear has that rounded off high frequency and a much deeper bottom low frequency, whereas a plug-in module is going to give you peaks and a much harsher top end and not as much low end as analog gear is going to give you. Now, cost. Let's talk about cost. Again, this thing, $1,000, $1,000 right there, approximately. You can buy a plug-in for 50, 60, 70, $100. So why spend that $1,000 when you can get something comparable for 1/10 of the price? Answer is very simple. Your personal preference. How do you like to work? How do I like to work? My studio is hybrid. I use both plugins and I use analog gear. I love the Rupert Neve stuff. I've said it 100 times here on my channel, so I know that you are already familiar with the fact that I have a lot of Rupert Neve gear in my studio. I just love the way it sounds. To me, personally, the quality and the build of Rupert Neve gear is fantastic. And let me say this while I'm thinking about it. When I throw out the words or the name Rupert Neve, understand something. Rupert Neve isn't giving me a dime for making these videos. They don't send me any gear for free, nothing like that. I'm not a sponsor of their gear. I am not an official spokesman for their gear. Nothing like that exists. This is just me, my little humble studio, expressing my opinions and sharing my ideas and my insights on different pieces of gear. I receive no money from anything that I review. Okay, so let's just get that out of the way. Now, the alternative, obviously, to analog gear is software. I want to give you an idea of a really good piece of software that you can use if you're not ready to shill out that $1,000 for a piece of analog gear. In particular, Solid State Logic. Excellent, excellent company. They've been in business for many, many years, many, many decades. They do it and they do it right. If you're in the market for software, compressors, EQs, dynamics, whatever the case may be, I strongly and highly suggest looking at the Solid State Logic suite of plugins. They are fantastic. I'm going to say that again. They are fantastic. I own the complete suite of Solid State Logic plugins, and I will tell you that that bus compressor is outstanding. The channel strip is outstanding. A few of the others that they make, such as the drum strip, outstanding. Cannot beat it. For software, you can't beat them. And folks will look at that and say, well, they're kind of pricey. The channel strip, I think, normally sells for about $300. The compressor sells for about $300. And the vocal strip, I think, is like $150, something like that. But they do have sales on them. But people say, well, Solid State Logic stuff, that their plugins are so expensive as compared to other plugins that I could get for 50, 60 bucks. This is true. This is very true. But as the old saying goes, you get what you pay for. And with Solid State Logic, You're getting quality stuff, high quality stuff. It works and it sounds fantastic. So, just a little plug for Solid State Logic. If you're not ready to spend $1,000 on hardware, take a look at those plugins that they make. They are absolutely outstanding. So, let's get back to the original question. Is analog gear better than plugins? The answer is no. It's not better, it's different. There's a different sound, there's a different feel. It creates a different environment inside of your studio. That's the big difference. Does it sound better? What is it that your ears are trying to hear? What is it that you're trying to create? What is the atmosphere that, or the theme of the music that you're creating that you want to use using either the plugin or the hardware? If you're going hybrid, then you have the best of both worlds. If you're strictly going digital and digital plugins, that's fine. There's a guy out there, I can't remember his last name. I know his first name is Jason, and I can't remember the last name right now. I'll put it up on the screen. After I make this video, I'll put his name up on the screen. I'll look it up for you. But here's a guy who does everything 100% in the box. Everything that he does is done with plug-in software. Doesn't use any analog gear. This man has made hit record after hit record after hit record for numerous very successful artists, all in the box. And he's not the only one. There's a lot of them out there. There are studios, of course, that swear off plugins and only use analog gear. And that's fine too. It's their personal preference. But is that stating a case or making a case for the fact that, well, these multi-million-dollar studios are using analog gear and they don't use plugins, so I'm not going to touch them because obviously analog gear must be better? That's not the case, and that's not true. It all depends on what it is that you're trying to do and the sound that you're trying to create. And then, of course, we're talking about money because analog gear is a lot more expensive. Again, $1,000. $1,000 for something about the size of a paper plate. $1,000. I could get 10 plugins for $100, a compressor, a reverb, a delay, an EQ. The list goes on. Name 10 different types of plugins that you can get. And I can have a full suite of plugins and go ahead and start recording as opposed to spending that same $1,000 on that one piece of gear. However, I'm a big fan of Rupert Neve. I'm a big fan of analog gear. It's my personal preference, my choice to use analog gear in combination with plugins because, like I said, I use those Solid State Logic plugins as well. Each is going to have their own place in my studio for certain situations, for certain sounds that I'm trying to create, for the certain atmosphere or texture that I'm trying to create. Each one is going to have its own place. So, analog gear is not better than digital plugins. Analog gear and digital plugins are different. Analog gear is obviously more expensive than a digital plugin. Question is, which one do you prefer and why? It's that simple. It's really that simple. I am not going to knock plugins because they're less expensive and they're a dime a dozen. And yeah, they're a dime a dozen. There's 100 different plugins that are out there. And I'm not going to knock analog gear. They're too expensive. The wear and tear, and sooner or later they wear out and you have to replace them. Whereas a plugin, you're never going to have to replace it. Yeah, there's an argument for each of those. But it doesn't mean that one is better than the other. Hope that helps. Until next time, G-Sharp Jams out, and as I always say, stay creative, keep creating, and remember to think outside of the box, because if you thought of it, and you tried it, and it worked, then it's right. Everybody have a great rest of your day.